tools of conquest do not necessarily come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices, to be found only in the minds of men. For the record, prejudices can kill, and suspicion can destroy. And a thoughtless, frightened search for a scapegoat has a fallout all of its own. For the children, and the children yet unborn. And the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined to the Twilight Zone.
There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
There's so much sci-fi to choose from on TV these days that you may have missed the recent reboots of the legendary Twilight Zone. Incredibly, not including the 1983 movie version, this is the third reboot of the seminal All-American anthology TV series that originally ran from 1959 to 1964. The two previous ones pretty much passed me by, but I do have very fond memories of the movie version and used to love watching late night reruns of the original series on Channel 4, so I was intrigued enough to check out a couple of episodes when it returned last year, with the very of-the-moment Jordan Peele helming production and taking over the narration role, first famously delivered by the show's creator, Rod Serling, throughout the original run. I was especially intrigued to watch what had been billed as a reimagining of the classic episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet by legendary writer Richard Matheson. As well as being the most memorable segment of the movie version, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet is one of the most loved episodes from the original series, starring William Shatner and a spooky but also kind of cuddly teddy bear shaped gremlin up to no good on the wing of his passenger plane. I would describe the 2019 version as twice as long and half as interesting as the original, and indeed that observation seems to essentially sum up the general critical consensus of the entire first season. And if Rotten Tomatoes is anything to go by, while the critics were at best lukewarm, actual audiences were downright scathing, with terms like woke, liberal lecturing and political correctness popping up on a depressingly regular basis. Like the best science fiction, the Twilight Zone always did regularly hold up a mirror to social issues of the day, and it was famous for injecting a sting into the story's tale that often offered relatively unsubtle slices of morality and food for thought. So I guess at least to some extent in 2019 a woke Twilight Zone was to be expected. But in fairness, I didn't give up after 2 episodes because I found it to be particularly woke. I just thought it wasn't very good. But then again, across the full run, those that stuck around were apparently treated to heavy-handed morality tales covering grounds such as Black Lives Matter, Donald Trump's presidency, illegal immigrants, and gun control, concluding in the muddled meta-season finale Blurry Man, which apparently was trying to say something about the line between arts and entertainment, but mostly involved a black lesbian scriptwriter being stalked across empty studio sets by a supernatural supernatural, shadowy, blurry white man, who turns out to be none other than Rod Sterling himself. And then there is episode 7, Not All Men, which I think it's fair to say is at least as woke as it is not very good, which is to say that it is extremely woke indeed. Woke enough and bad enough that I thought I'd briefly bring it to your attention and invite you to spend a few moments contemplating the wacky world of Jordan Peele's extremely woke Twilight Zone. So, Annie's a young professional just getting started on her career. She's eager to say yes and perhaps has a little difficulty saying no, because when we first meet her, her nice but mansplainy man boss has just dumped a big pile of work on her desk. Office nice guy Dylan offers to have a word on her behalf, an offer which she declines because she doesn't want people to think she's not a team player. But she does take him up on his offer of an intimate lobster dinner and bird's eye view of a meteor shower over at his swanky bachelor pad later that same evening. Dylan's a pretty confident guy and also in a position of authority to little Annie. And while she does appear flattered by the invitation, I'm pretty sure we're supposed to feel that to some degree. She kind of feels compelled to say yes, and that maybe this isn't the first time Dylan's made a play for the office new girl. Anywho, later that night, the date ends abruptly after Dylan gets a tad too handsy, and after Annie makes a swift exit, he proceeds to do what any self-respecting guy would do under the circumstances, and channels his feelings of rejection into a healthy bout of home-wrecking. This is the first in a number of early scenes that establish the central theme of the episode, namely that people can sometimes really act like arseholes. And when I say people, I really mean men. But as our mousy protagonist slowly begins to suspect, maybe it's not actually their fault. Because this is, after all, the woke Twilight Zone, so perhaps some supernatural shenanigans are really at play. In this case, a bombardment of meteor rocks that appear to have contaminated the town's water supply, and one of which nice guy Dylan got his hands on just before he got, well, a tad handsy. And so after Annie has a quick yoga session to calm the nerves, we get to meet the rest of the cast that have been chosen to help drag this shit show over the line. Roughly in order of appearance, we have Perry from The Office, Annie's nice but mansplainy boss, her slightly effeminate soy boy nephew, her older, less prissy sister Martha, and Martha's apparently woke husband Mike, who we're led to believe is one of the good guys because he donned an apron to cook birthday girl Martha a fancy dinner, and then gets overexcited about the frying pan shaped presents Annie thoughtfully brought to the party. So after dinner, Annie and Martha head out for drinks with the girls, and this is where things very quickly take a turn for the worst, when a bunch of blokes turn up, order a few meteor-infused shots of the hard stuff, and proceed to beat the absolute shit out of each other. Perry from The Office then takes a hump when Annie ignores him in the car park. He then does what any self-respecting chap would do when a woman insults him in public, and proceeds to follow her home on his bike, meaning that woke husband Mike has to step up and do the right white knight thing in the driveway, while Annie and Martha car inside. Defending his woman turns out to be thirsty, dirty work, and obviously feeling the strain of all this responsibility. Upon his return, woke husband Mike starts to open up a little and share his thoughts about feeling underappreciated and even undermined by his wife. A relationship dynamic which is underlined by Martha's reluctance to blow out the candles on the birthday cake he lovingly prepared earlier that same day.
Honey, blow out the candles, but don't forget to make a wish.
I don't want to, Mike.
Do it! Oh, I gotta come closer. Yay!
Annie interrupts this intimate unburdening, provoking Mike to get all handsy, which in turn inspires Martha to have a go on that aforementioned frying pan-shaped birthday gift. The sisters then spill out onto the streets and straight into a full-blown riot, where half the townsfolk have essentially gone feral. Nice but mansplainy boss pops up to helpfully confirm Annie's suspicion that all this chaos has indeed been caused by some sort of space infection caused by the meteors, before the sisters do a runner and leave nice but mansplainy boss to his manly fate. All of which leads Martha to decide that desperate times call for desperate measures, and propose that if the meteors are indeed infecting the townsfolk, then the best way to fight back is to join the ranks of the infected. This insane leap of logic can inevitably only lead to disappointment and mean that Annie has to spell out the obvious science behind meteor-based inequality of outcome.
It's just that... Get off my top!
Dun dun dun. Would you Adam and Eve it? It's just the men. A revelation which quickly leads us to the climax of our story down at the harbour, where they catch up with Martha's slightly effeminate soy boy son, who has just had to cut an intimate drinking session with his boyfriend short due to yet more excessive handsiness. Creepy Dylan, who presumably has been stalking Annie all over town, shows up swinging a massive chunk of space rock, which, after one last bout of handsiness, our hero uses to go all Charlie's Angel on his ass and dispatch him to the depths. The army then rock into town, restore law and order, everybody left standing, presumably lives happily ever after. And happily, this valuable life experience has even helped to toughen up little Annie and finally equip her with the confidence to just say no.
IDs, please. No? I bet you look much cuter if you smiled.
What did you say?
Why don't you try it sometime?
In many ways, Not All Men covers similar ground to the 2006 Masters of Horror anthology episode, The Screwfly Solution, that I examined in a previous episode of this series. Both utilise the toxic testosterone-infused trope of violent men to propel their tale of terror. But by comparison, Not All Men is very much the clunky straight-to-video per relation of the two. It may have its flaws, but I think The Screwfly Solution is pretty compelling viewing, not least because it's based on a classic short story that presents possibly the most convincing concept for an alien invasion that I've ever heard. By comparison, Not All Men just comes across as corny, unconvincing B-movie kitsch, and while both stories do obviously offer extremely negative portrayals of men and our nature, it's the sting in the tail of the story that truly elevates Not All Men into full-blown woke and frankly blindly bigoted territory. Because in the closing moments, Martha's soy boy son reveals that he has tested negative for non-terrestrial toxicity, despite the fact that he has spent the entire episode walking around with a space rock in his pocket. A revelation that can only mean one thing: space disease isn't real, and there can therefore be no cure, because the meteor rocks were nothing more than a placebo that somehow unleashed the toxicity that naturally exists in every single man. Every single man, including Soy Boy's son, who explains that deep down he's just as toxic as the rest of us, but he simply chose to maintain a little self-control. It's really that simple. He just chose not to be an arsehole. A revelation which leads Jordan Peele to mansplain to any slow learners at the back that what Annie has just witnessed was no material disease, but rather a plague of conscience that had given men permission to unleash their inner arsehole and ignore presumably feminine traits such as decency, consent, and fear. And that any old excuse such as a few innocuous little rocks is enough to turn men into monsters, at least in the woke Twilight Zone. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. In the woke Twilight Zone, all it takes are a few innocuous little rocks to turn men into monsters. Not all men, you understand, but certainly the very vast majority of them. Although when Jordan Peele infers that from his production's perspective, most men are always just one step away from savagery, presumably he doesn't mean men like him? Then again, perhaps he does. Perhaps he's literally inferring that concepts such as decency, consent, and consideration for his female co-workers are simply shackles imposed by external forces that hold back his true manifestation of self. Shackles he can imagine all too effortlessly ejecting with the flimsiest of excuse. But I suspect that Jordan more likely imagines that he is one of the unique minority of men capable of having the decency to simply choose not to unleash their inner monster. Indeed, perhaps it's even special men like him that help to hold back the floodgates by plaguing and policing most other men's conscience and denying them permission to simply do what thou wilt in civilized company. And perhaps such a relatively rare inner fortitude and respect for women has been forged through some sort of shared experience of oppression or othering that makes people like him and Martha's homosexual son somehow somewhat better than most men. Then again, even though throughout the season the show featured a significantly diverse cast of characters, perhaps it's purely coincidental that, with one notable exception, all of the monsters that tear up Annie's world appear to be straight white men. Then again, imagine the uproar had they all been portrayed as black, or brown, or Muslim, or indeed any other sex. At the end of the day, Not All Men is just bad sci-fi and bad TV, and its message more so merits ridicule, even if its intention is to invite offence. But with that all said, inevitably and appropriately enough, this oh-so-woke trip to the Twilight Zone has one last sting in its tail. One so ironic that it inspired me to submit this story to your attention. Because much like that disappointing earlier episode I mentioned, Not All Men is in actual fact a reimagining of a classic original series tale, one that often tops the list of the most memorable Twilight Zone stories of all time. The monsters are due on Maple Street. For the uninitiated, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street tells the story of a white picket fence all-American suburban street, which is quickly turned upside down in the aftermath of a possible meteor flying overhead. Pretty soon, neighbours are in the streets speculating about the cause of localised power outages and proposing the possibility of an extraterrestrial invasion. Before long, there is suspicion that an advanced party of aliens may even be living in disguise amongst them. Hysteria takes hold and everyone becomes a suspect. Panic of monsters steadily builds until the entire neighbourhood turns into an angry mob and on each other. The ending scene reveals alien observers watching the riots on Maple Street and knowing that they created the mass hysteria with a few simple bangs and crashes and flickering of the lights. The aliens conclude that conquering Earth will be easy because the humans will destroy themselves. The moral of the story being that the real monsters on Maple Street had lived there all along and indeed lurk on every street in the world. The message being that mankind has long since had the capacity for fear, suspicion and, yes, prejudice. Prejudice that all too easily leads to the othering of strangers, or those somehow different to the crowd. A prejudice that can permit normally peaceful people to ignore decency, consent and fear. In the original story, the message was a metaphor for an America plagued by McCarthyism and Cold War paranoia. But one of the reasons why it is so fondly remembered is that it is a relatively universal tale with a message that can easily be tweaked to apply to more modern times. Indeed, the 2003 remake swapped out aliens for the possibility of sleeper cells of terrorists and ultimately led to a post-9/11 mob burning out the most recent arrivals on their particular Maple Street. And so, hilariously, an awareness of the rich heritage that this most recent imagining is built upon also invites a much more meta-interpretation of the message that its creators consciously chose to project. Because if we are to understand that our woke writers view most, if not quite all men, in the same way that previous generations of Americans have been portrayed to have had the potential to view any neighbour that is somehow a little different to them, then who exactly is it that we should view as the real monsters of Jordan Peele's Maple Street? To paraphrase the words of a wise old man, in this time of uncertainty, some people are so certain that bad men lurk around every corner that even if they can't always find them, they will always create them. For while fear may keep us vigilant, It's also fear that tears us apart. It is fear that divides us. And it is a fear that exists, only all too often, outside the Twilight Zone.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.